The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, folks. I want to welcome you to our webinar tonight, Growing Up Different, Understanding Our Families. It's about foster care and adoption and its impact on learning, identity, and self-image in multiracial families. My name is Kim Stevens, and I am a program manager at North American Council on Adoptable Children. I want to just tell you real quickly that everybody will be muted, but we will be looking for questions during the webinar. So just go ahead to that question box, type in what your question is, and we will get to them as we can. We'll also have some time at the end for questions and answers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Mercedes.
Hi, so my name is Mercedes Zoller. I'm the Youth Engagement Coordinator for the North American Council on Adoptable Children. I'm also a transracial adoptee myself, my brother, and my sister, who are all three adopted from different biological families, are all adopted as well. My brother is an African American adoptee, along with myself, and then my little sister is white. All right, you can go on to the first slide, Kim. So when talking about transracial adoption, I think oftentimes we dive right into the issues, but sometimes we miss really important key terms and things that are very important for people to know going into this, being able to differentiate some of these terms. So race is associated with the biological makeup. It's your physical characteristics and your biological body parts. It's the skin pigment or lack thereof that contribute to diverse appearances. Other ethnicity is a term for culture, and it's often the culture of people in a given geographic region. This includes things like language, heritage, religion, customs, ancestry, practice, beliefs. Culture is the way of life of a group of people, meaning the way that they do things. The big difference between ethnicity and culture is that ethnicity is defined as a category of people who identify with each other based off of similar geographic regions, and are often defined by biological similarities, as where culture is more human behavior, and it cannot be attributed to genetic inheritance, and instead has more to do with common attitudes amongst groups of people, social norms, what's acceptable, etc. And then your heritage is your history, it's your bloodline, it's family trees, it's where you come from. So this webinar will really focus heavily on racial identity and how to support young people in growing in their racial identity. So racial identity, to me, is defined as my sense of belonging to a group or collective identity based off of a shared heritage. So all people who've grown up, everyone on this webinar has experienced some form finding a sense of identity. But for transracial adoptees, we have this additional layer of trying to decide where we fit in. Identity is this fluid, lifelong process, and for transracial adoptees, it's something that we're constantly re-exploring because we're not necessarily living in households where there's lots of people who look like us. We're in very diverse households often. Identity can be influenced by so many factors, and for transracial adoptees, it's oftentimes influenced by their parents, peers, and then their ethnicity. There's also an additional layer of trying to navigate if it's safe to identify with particular groups. And by safe, I mean, like, will they be accepted by parents, by friends, by peers? If they come out and they identify as a person of color, fear that, they may be rejected for owning their cultural heritage. And the concept of identity is very individualistic, and each person has the right to explore their own identity and define their own identity. All right.
So I neglected to mention, Hi, folks. I've neglected to mention I am also a person with lived experience as an adoptive parent. My husband and I have 3 children who are adopted, African American children, two siblings, and a younger young man. And this right here is Melvin. Many of you have seen his picture and heard me talk about him quite a bit. I always like to share with people some really some understandings that I got from a colleague of mine, Sue Harris O'Connor, and another colleague, Dr. Ruth McCroy, who have done quite a bit of work around transracial adoption and understanding how racial identity comes together, and also understanding what young people need and what their parents are really responsible to offer for them. Sue talks a lot about the fact that your racial identity comes in 5 different constructs. So clearly there is the genetic racial identity, which is, your genes, what you're born with. An imposed racial identity is really what someone assigns you as based on their assumptions or biases. Cognitive racial identity would be what your understanding, what your intellect understands about your identity. Whereas feeling racial identity can be different. It's how you feel inside. Later on in the PowerPoint, there's a couple of poems that I want to share with people written by adoptees who really talk about how that feeling and what they know to be true are often very different. And then finally, visual racial identity is how you look. And that can be very tied up with the imposed racial identity. The other things that influence the way that a young person develops their racial identity is, first of all, how old they are and what their cognitive and emotional and other development are at the time, both at the time of when they were placed in a family, but also as they are going through that. Their racial environment, who is around them? Do they see people that look like them? Do they have role models that come from their cultural background? And what have their socialization experiences been? How have they heard about or come to understand who they are based on what the larger society is saying, either implicitly or explicitly? Now, this picture right here, I want to point out to you, this is Tanya and Justice, 2 of my kids. And when Justice was about 16 years old, he was presenting on a panel with me and talked about the fact that he went into a white family without ever having known this. I'm going to say it came as a shock to all of us because there had been quite a bit of preparation. Justice got a book with all of our pictures. Justice met us prior to ever moving forward. Justice's social worker had numerous conversations with him and with his sister Tanya about what kind of family, what would feel comfortable, how would this be. But as Justice and I explored further to find out why he thought he'd never had any of these, we realized it was because he was only 6 years old at the time. And when you're 6 years old, the need for a family far outweighs any of the other things that you're thinking about. So it was a real eye opener, but I think underscores the importance of knowing how your child is understanding who they are, where they belong, what their decisions, what kind of impact their decisions are going to have. When you think about the fact that as a child gets older, as their cognition and their socialization is increasing, those ideas, those feelings are definitely going to change over time. The other thing that we have to think about is how everybody's identity changes and develops over time, but in particular for our kids who are in families that don't look the same as them. So even as young as 3 years old, children can be aware of skin color differences, can be aware of race. They hear things, they wonder about things. I can remember my son Melvin, one of his first full sentences to me was, "Look, Mommy, you're day and I'm night." And so very much aware of what his eyes were telling him. Between the ages of 4 to 6, kids can really identify groups. They are beginning to put positive and negative value on groups. People might remember some experimentation that was done several decades ago about children selecting dolls that were either white or light skinned or darker skinned, and which dolls were the good dolls and which dolls were the not so good dolls. if you look up that baby doll experiment, you'll see that there were a lot of implicit biases that children were already hanging on to at this young age. 7 to 11, kids are starting to really be out in the world on their own more. They're exploring the meaning of being different. They're exploring what their group is like, what their group is like within their small family and how do they fit in, but also what the group was that they came from. And they're starting to be able to calculate that social mathematics. Where is privilege and how is it being shown to different people? Between the ages of 12 and 18, of course, our kids are really coming into their own. They're putting a lot more value on what they're seeing out in the world. And certainly for our kids at the ages of 16, 17, 18, who are driving and out in the community, there are safety issues that are beginning to come to play.
So young people, so young children, really young children are going to be super interested a lot of times in attending cultural events because a lot of times there's a fun aspect to it. But as your child ages, they move from their motivations tend to shift. So as they're moving towards preteen their thinking is getting a lot more concrete, and they may start to pull away and reject being culturally immersed because their friends aren't doing it. That's not similar experiences maybe that their peers are having. So it's super important to connect your children with other children that look like them or families that look like them. Children who attend racially diverse schools or reside in racially diverse communities are a lot more likely to notice race at an earlier age. And children surrounded by diversity may have an easier time finding their identity. Uh, for young people who, like myself, I was raised in a really white, really rural community. And I had a lot of great opportunities growing up here, but there were also a lot of things that I struggled with for a longer time. In elementary school, I think one of the hardest things is young people don't quite have a filter yet. They haven't been able to differentiate, so they just say whatever. And a lot of the things that my peers would say were really pointing out blatantly obvious things like, your parents don't look like you. Why is your mom a foot shorter than you in the 4th grade? And all these things that kids were constantly pointing out that my family looked different to me. It made me feel really targeted. It made me feel singled out. And going through elementary school, this was something my parents were constantly combating is, how do we support our young person through this? And so being connected with other families who had similar experience was vital to us. We spent a lot of holidays with other families, a close family of ours who is also a transracially adopted family. And I'm very close with the son and that family who's my age, who we had a lot of similar experiences growing up. And we could talk about these things. I'm ready for the next slide, Kim.
I put it for this is the next one. Is this the one you
Yeah.
want, maybe? Yeah.
Oh, back one.
Okay, sorry.
There you go. Okay, and then preteens, we're really just searching to be accepted by our peers. Teenage years are this constant struggle of identity for any young person, but for a transracial adoptee, it's really trying to find identity and independence outside of their home. And this may be for a lot of young people the first time that they're really trying to find their way in racial groups. So it may be sitting with young people that look like them at the lunch table. It may be making friends of diverse races, whatever it is. They may really be testing those boundaries with their parents, trying to explore their own cultural identity. And school is a challenging place for teenagers, and finding their social circles and racial identity can be really challenged or hindered by who they see around them. In schools that are predominantly white, young people may start to change appearances and behaviors trying to fit in. It's really normal for young people to want to fit in. I know for myself, it was straightening my hair to look more like my friends, which is pretty normal teenage behavior. But it also caused me to reject a lot of my cultural appearances and a lot of my own physical appearances. So, like, my hair is very curly. I have an afro, and it's something that I learned to love, but I really rejected and I really hated growing up as a teenager because I wasn't surrounded by a lot of people that looked like me that had those things. Um, but when I came into college, I had a great mentor who was a natural hair advocate, and she really walked me through a lot of these things. And for me, it was great to finally be surrounded by people who had a better understanding of my hair, of my identity, of some of these cultural issues. So I wish I had more role models in my preteen years and more people that maybe look like me that I could ask some of these questions surrounding race, because my parents are incredible, but they couldn't answer all my questions that I had because they didn't have the lived experience.
That's a great segue to this next slide, Mercedes. And I think um, for me, as a parent of children who are African American, being a white parent, I learned many things the hard way. Hopefully, I learned some of them earlier rather than later. But we do want to spend some time helping parents understand and also giving young people permission to ask for those things that they need. So we've got this table here that we've put together. The issue for a parent to address for their child, the first issue, the absence of an adult of color in the family. Now, that's not necessarily true in every family where there's a multiracial, multicultural um, placement. However, for many, many of our young people who are in families adopted, their parents are white and they may be, the child himself may be Latino, African American, Asian, and the list can go on. So, one of the interventions and something that we used in our family that was very helpful was with the fact that we shared our parenting with other adults of color. We had a number of friends, African American moms and dads, who we welcomed into our family circle to be that parenting type adult that could step in and help teach us, but also be there for our kids. Certainly, there's a need for parents of children of a different race, actually, for any parent, I think, especially in this day and age, but particularly for families, multiracial families. It's very important that the parents are race conscious. So, the way to do that is to be educated, to pay attention, to be an ally, to not be afraid to have difficult conversations, and especially not be afraid to look inside yourself and really think about some of the messages that you might have had as a child growing up, either in your own family or in your community, that might be causing you to have implicit biases that you aren't even aware of. Another issue is to have really an awareness of the adoption issues of rejection and abandonment, which are multi-layered for kids who have lost not just their birth family, but also their community and their culture of origin. And so, what we can do as parents to be strong and available for our children is to validate those feelings that they may have, to anticipate those feelings. And I always often think of holding the feelings for the child. So certainly nobody wants to be told how they feel. People own their own feelings. But oftentimes for my own kids, if I knew that they were hurting, if I knew that they were struggling with something, I would try to put myself in their place and talk about whatever that struggle was as if I were carrying it. So for a good example would be, Justice came home one day and told me that he had been followed around in a store by a security person. And I said, wow, if that happened to me, I would be so many things. I would be hurt. I would be insulted. I would be furious. I named all kinds of different feelings that were totally appropriate so that we could open up a conversation and Justice would understand that while I don't know what it's like, I certainly can be open to trying to feel those feelings with him. The impact of visibility is really hard on our kids. They are not really the ones that carry the brunt of it. When we're out in public and people are looking and people are making assumptions and judgments just based on what they can see. Our kids who are adopted in multiracial families, our kids can't hide the fact that they're adopted. And I don't say that because it's something to be hidden or something to be ashamed of, but they don't have that same luxury of being able to tell those people that they want to tell at the time that they want to tell them, because so many assumptions are made based on how they look as compared to how the rest of their family looks. And so, one of the things that we can do as parents is to be, first of all, very aware of the fact that our kids are the ones that are carrying this much more and in more difficult ways than we are. We can prepare them for that and talk about it. We can role play. We can practice words that we can use or approaches that we can take when we're feeling uncomfortable, and really give kids permission to be in charge of sort of their own story and the way they are in the world. Hair and skincare certainly are critical, and I know Mercedes is going to talk more about that. But don't be afraid to ask and to find people that will help. I know that for my kids, it was a tradition for us at least one Saturday a month. We would go and hang out at my friend's house, African American woman who would do everybody's hair, and we would just have a lovely, very culturally welcoming and appropriate experience for my kids. And then there's, of course, the systemic racism that we all know exists. Um, in fact, starting right from the beginning with entering into child welfare, so many more of our kids of color are in the system because of systemic racism. We know that there are things that happen in schools around what are normal expectations. And I do use that with quotation marks around the word normal. So, what we need to do is be relentless advocates. We need to speak out. We need to also arm our child. And I also want to put a cautionary piece in there about being that vocal advocate, being that person that speaks out. I spoke with my kids a lot about really giving them the power to tell me when to speak up and when they wanted to, let me know what my place was in all of that advocacy. And I think that is very important as well, that our kids really lead and let us know what they need.
Uh, so, as Kim said, I'm going to talk about hair. I'm really passionate about hair, and every panel I've sat on, or been a part of, or led that has an adoptee or youth who has been in care, who has been placed with a family different than their color, they talk about um, the nuance of hair, this complicated aspect. Uh, and so, for young people, specifically Black and Brown youth, our hair is this incredible but complicated part of our identity. And so growing up, my hair was this daily battle. There are lots of picture evidence of really unsuccessful hair days, uh, unfortunately. And for a long time, like I thought straight hair was best. So I would fry my hair to get it straight like my friends. And it really wasn't until my junior year of college that I embraced and accepted my hair because I had a mentor, somebody to walk me through this. But when I was young, you know, at an age, there's an age where you take your hair into your own hands. And I did that probably a little younger than I should have. But growing up, my mom really wanted to learn. That was one of the things I think she did best. She wanted to learn about my hair. She wanted to learn how to do it. She wanted to learn how to really take care of it. And so my mom took hair braiding classes, and my mom is not a fast braider by any means, but she is one of the best braiders I know to this day. And I have worked with lots of African hair braiders who do it as a living, do it to make a living wage. And I still think my mom is top notch. And so it wasn't easy for her. It was learning a whole new concept. It really is like a part-time job taking care of natural hair. And I think it was also something that she was very afraid of, to ask questions at first. And when I was very young, a woman approached her in a Target and said, you got to do something with that baby's hair, and offered to help teach my mom. So she would come out to our house on Saturday mornings and teach my mom to braid. And so I remember sitting in a chair for 8 hours at a time, which is something that probably should have taken a lot less time, but it was really my mom taking the time to learn and do what is best for me. Uh, Also, then, what would have been really important to me, I think, growing up, was to have more people who look like me for those reasons, to be able to identify with hair and culture. Hair is such a huge part of identity. It's a huge part of how we look for young men and for young women, and to be well groomed. It's a part of our grooming, our maintenance. It's the way that people perceive us. So when we feel like our hair is good, um, there's not one type of hair that's best. There's not one type of hair that's worst. Your hair is your hair, and we work with it and we do what we can with it. So for parents who are curious, like where to even start, there's a lot of really amazing curly hair salons out there, and African braiding salons out there. And a lot of these salons offer classes for parents who want to learn how to best take care of their child's hair, who want, a lot of these times these classes are pretty inexpensive, and they offer really great tips, tricks, and advice and ongoing support for parents who are trying to take care of natural hair. So next we're going to talk about some common misconceptions of things that may be seemingly positive attitudes towards race and identity. So one of these things is color blindness. When I was adopted, I'm 24 years old. So 24 years ago, when my parents were going through the adoption process, they were told that the best way to raise a child is of another race is to approach it with a colorblind attitude. If we address race and we talk about it, it'll cause this great racial divide in your household. It'll be this great canyon. And one thing I think my parents realized really quickly as soon as I was really coming into my own racial identity, that by not talking about it was causing this huge racial divide. And so colorblindness is this attitude of we don't see color. We just see everybody as one part of the human race. We're one race. And a lot of times this common attitude towards adoptees is, we don't see you as a person of color. And I know that I have had many people tell me, oh, I don't see you as a person of color. And while I know it's not oftentimes meant as a insult, to me, I take it as very insulting because I am a person of color. That is who I am. And it starts to create all these doubts and misconceptions and questions about my identity. And so it's really important to not approach it from this colorblind perspective, to really celebrate the race and the diversity in your household and amongst your children, I think is huge. And then transcendence is this other attitude that I think a lot of times I think I experience this most in schools and in like group settings where, we're not focused on the differences amongst us. We're just gonna focus on what's inside. Um, it's what's in your heart that's good, and well, that is all good. We want to instill the best things, but overlooking physical appearance and our differences, I think our differences are what make us unique. It's what make us great, and so to completely negate someone's physical appearances. The pigment of my skin is part of my identity. My hair is different. It's not something I'm ashamed of. So to have an attitude that, we're kind of above it is to really negate this identity concept. This is you, Kim.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mercedes.
No worries.
I do want to talk a bit about white privilege, and for families, parents who are on this webinar, um, white parents with children of color, you have probably had the same experiences that I have had, where being out in public with your children gives you a whole new perspective on what white privilege is, what it looks like, um, and how easily recognizable it is when you pay attention. So it is defined as a right, an advantage, or an immunity that is granted to or enjoyed by white persons beyond the common advantage of others. And so I really want people to think about that. And I'm going to just go right out on a limb and say the people who are on this webinar understand that white privilege is real, understand that it exists. But there are a lot of people in the world who don't understand what it is that we're talking about when we discuss white privilege. There are a lot of people in our country right now that think that if you have suffered, if you have been poor, if you have had misfortune or struggles as a white person, then that negates this idea of white privilege. But really, what white privilege means is that all of those things may have happened to you, but they were not happening to you because of the color of your skin. Um, I can often hear people that are in the business of being very much upfront and very aware of white privilege will sometimes refer to their skin as a passport, and that's often exactly how it's treated. But it is important to define it very carefully. We have to be aware of the fact that it gets contested all the time. We have to also be very aware and upfront about the fact that even when people are contesting whether or not white privilege is real, that in itself, just that very denial of it, is a racialized action or belief. And we also need to know that for people of color, those folks who are embracing and dedicated to the privilege that they have had, they may not see that they are being oppressive, but they are, and they are going to continue to be because letting go of that privilege for them feels, I would say, probably scary more than anything else. But I always think about this and this whole idea around privilege, and if other people get more, I'm going to lose something, is being really ridiculous. I even think about how we talk to children and we tell them to have more people love you is great. It doesn't, my loving this person does not negate my loving you, right? So it doesn't mean that that there's any less of the pie just because everybody gets to share it. And I know that my metaphors are not working very well, but I think it gets summed up really by the comment down in the corner of this slide. It doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It simply means that your skin color is not one of the things making it harder. We do know as well, and I talked earlier about systemic racism, when we look at some of the statistics around educational inequalities, it's really shocking. In 2005, 48% of fourth grade Black students attended high poverty schools, compared with 5% of fourth grade white students. Now, the significance about being in a high poverty school is that, first of all, there's not a big enough tax base to provide kids with what they need. And second of all, in schools where there is not a high poverty rate, there are also families that can contribute to extras like extracurriculars and tutors and all of the things that give children a leg up when they're trying to learn. The percentage of 16 to 24-year-olds who were high school dropouts was higher among Black students than whites and Asian Pacific Islanders. This 2005 assessment showed that there were much higher percentages of Asian Pacific Islander and white students in the 4th, 8th, and 12th grade who were scoring at or above proficient than the Black students at the same grade level. And I would guess that that is a direct result of this first bullet point, where the high poverty schools just didn't have the resources in order to help their Black students achieve at the level that they could. And then finally, in 2006, we found that 18.5% of Blacks aged 25 and older earned a bachelor's degree or higher, compared with 31% of white students. And again, the more education you have, that is going to translate into better income, better lifestyle, more opportunities. When we think about all of the issues that parents and children are looking at, we talked about these before. But I love the fact that we have it here again with this image that is so profound about those kinds of issues. It, it looks like it's an insurmountable piece, but if you can go back to some of those implications, some of those strategies that I talked about in the earlier slide, you really will make a big difference for your kids. So here are a few things that white parents can do to be better informed and better responding to their kids right from the start. First of all, certainly you have to understand and check your own personal biases. I was brought up on the East Coast by an Irish Catholic and French Canadian family that was pretty insular, and many of their beliefs about people from different socioeconomic, but also from different racial classes, were completely uninformed and completely biased. And it was a journey for me to take a look at what I believe, to take a look at what I could hear my dad saying, in the back recesses of my mind, and bring those things up to the front part of my mind so that I could address them. Really have to look at that very closely. Understand how my white privilege could be used as an ally and an advocate for my child, but also recognize the fact that that very privilege, can be painful for them as well. To watch it, and if I use it in ways that are not according to what my kids want, if I appropriate their racial identity in ways that is not okay, these things can be really difficult. I think it's really important to think about cultural humility. And I think it's really, first of all, important not to use the term cultural competence, because that implies for me a certain arrogance about, I've got this down now, I know it all. I don't think any of us ever really know everything we need to know. When I think about cultural humility, for me, that means that I'm willing to be the person that is learning. I'm willing to be the person who is uncomfortable. I am willing to be the person who puts myself out there in ways that my kids are out there all the time. And just being aware and informed and curious, respectfully curious about all the things that I don't know. And then finally, just, let's have fun too. Let's be open. Let's celebrate. Let's try new things. And it doesn't have to be just reflective of the culture of your children who you've adopted, but really embracing the more cultures and the more different ways of being in the world that we embrace. I think it opens us up in so many ways to be accepting and kind and loving.
So, a bias is the attitudes or opinions and judgments we hold about groups of people. And a lot of times these judgments are made before there's any evidence that either confirms or contradicts. So bias can be sometimes positive and bias can be sometimes negative. So some common bias are often like stereotypes that are created about different groups of people. So like the image there, I'm 6 feet tall, so it's something that I get frequently. People stop me all the time. And do you play basketball? No. I'm currently in a cast right now for slipping and falling, just standing in place. I'm not coordinated enough to play basketball. But these are things that are constant attitudes. And for parents who are considering adopting or parents who have adopted, it's important to acknowledge the bias that we may have grown up with. Things like Kim talked about, attitudes towards race, towards opinions towards different groups of people that have been formed based off of what we've learned growing up. And then also things that maybe implicit. So implicit bias are things that you maybe don't even know. Hidden bias are these things that you don't even realize that you're harboring or you're carrying. To do some reflection, it's really important to take like implicit bias tests. One of the reasons it's so important is because these attitudes that you've adapted will be passed on to children. And so a child, if you are harboring some maybe implicit or hidden bias towards specific groups, stereotypes, these can impact your child directly. I know for myself, growing up in a really white community, uh, I was really forced to address some of these things. Once I hit college, I did a lot of self exploration, did some implicit bias quizzes, and things I realized I was experiencing. Jim?
So I think I talked about this a bit, competence versus humility. Competence implying an endpoint and humility implying that it's ongoing. I really love this cartoon. I think it's pretty cool. But Joe Gallagher has it right. To be culturally humble means that I'm willing to learn.
Perfect. So this, the picture on the bottom left is my family. As I said, my family's really cool. And the one young woman standing next to me was our foreign exchange student from Germany. Throughout my entire life, race had always been a really big thing. But the year that she came to stay with us was my senior year. And I think it was the first time that it really hit home for me as a young adult, as a young person, just how different my family was from other people's families. There was one night where we were at the grocery store and my mom had run into somebody she didn't know, and it was just us girls. So my sister, my mom, and I, and Steffi, our foreign exchange student. And my mom said, well, this is my daughter Mercedes, this is my daughter Ella, and this is our foreign exchange student Steffi. And immediately the woman turned to me and asked me where I was from. And it was the first time, I think for me, that it really solidified that people see me as different than family, that I really am, different. And so we correct her. We have a great sense of humor about it. But that year really opened up these conversations for us about race. And I know that Sophie was expecting to come into a family that looked so different, that was having these great conversations about race. But it was huge for her coming from a new country. And so as an adult, I found this longing to learn to be better educated about race relations, equity, and inclusion. And because of all these conversations that have sparked, there's been all these debates and mind shifts for my entire family. As Kim said, I think there's this huge part to the last slide, just to piggyback, of having cultural humility. When you're parents of a transracial adoptee, you're committing to be a lifelong learner, to continue to learn about these shifting attitudes. You are agreeing to be humbled at times where maybe you have an attitude or an idea that doesn't quite fit. But consistent conversations about race, it's not a scary thing. Talking about race is not going to push your child away, but actually instead will really make your child feel like it's safe. As a child begins to explore adulthood, like myself, I know that my parents being open to having conversations uh, has been so important to me, and it's totally meant the difference between a continued relationship with my family and separation from my family, which is something a lot of transracial adoptees face or explore because they fear that their cultural identity may not be accepted by their families as they're exploring it into adulthood.
So, some time back, there was an excellent article in the Huffington Post entitled What White Parents Should Know About Adopting Black Children. And this piece right here just really sums it up for me. The desire to love a Black child must be matched by the willingness to learn and accept the unique needs of Blackness and Black childhood. Going in with the mindset that this Black child is no different from any other child is a naivete the adoptive parent cannot afford. I would take it a bit further. It's a naivete that the child cannot afford for the parent to have. And I encourage you to take a look at the article. It's quite good. When my colleague, Dr. Ruth McCroy, did some research talking to transracial adoptive parents about the challenges that their kids were facing, they talked about so many things that really resonated with me. They were things that with the exclusion of one of them, I had heard every one of these things from my kids, being asked questions by their peers, being, judged. And I remember one time we were driving down the street and this little girl shouted at our car, "I can't be in the brownies because of you two." And I happened to have known who her mother was and knew that her mother um, was, well, she was just an outright racist. So this girl had left the brownies because of that. Um, my own child said to me that, I wish you were brown like me. And I sure agreed. I think that would have made life so much easier in so many ways. Kids making fun of the children, hair and skincare, obviously, we've talked about that. Again, being asked if the adoptive parent is the real mom. We never did have an experience with a KKK pamphlet dropped on the friend's door, but I will say that I know that where this research was done, it was not a place where you might assume that that might happen. Of course, at this point in time, we probably should have assumed it could happen anywhere. Um, it, that that comment, "You can't play here. This is only for the white kids." What a horrifying thing for a child to hear as they're trying to fit in with their peers. I'm going to let Mercedes talk about intent and impact.
So this is probably one of my favorite things to talk about because I think it's hit so close to home for any family that is ever adopted, but adoption microaggressions. And so while your children may face blatant racial aggression, most often and most frequently, they will likely face microaggressions. And microaggressions are micro, I think, or at least in my mind, I keep straight by the intent is different. The intent usually is not to harm or hurt, but the impact can be really detrimental and very hurtful. Oftentimes, these statements and these microaggressions come from people in your inner circle. They may come from extended family members, teachers, friends, community members, and people may feel they may make statements or ask really inappropriate questions that are not intended with harm, or they don't have ill intent often, but unfortunately, they are really rude. I know many times, my extended family members have come up behind me and still to this day at times touch my hair. And, to touch a Black woman's hair has a really big implication in and of itself. But I remember my aunt one day was playing with my hair and almost like you pet a dog and scrunching my hair. And she says, "Oh my gosh, your hair is so fluffy. It's just like a dog." And to me, I was so angry and so hurt and so upset. And I know she didn't mean to call me a dog. I know she wasn't trying to infer that I was an animal, but to have to call her out on that. And as a young person, I was probably 13, 14 at the time. So to try to find the language to do that, my mom was really great at correcting her as to why that was wrong. And she was really embarrassed when she realized. And unfortunately, not all the time people are going to be so embarrassed and sorry. A lot of times people react to being called out on things different ways. Some people do feel embarrassed and, well, that's really not how I meant it. I apologize. And sometimes people kind of brush it off as, well, that's not how I meant it. So parents who are able to correct individuals and who are able to like redirect people can really help their young person find the language in the future, because their young person will face this. This is not something that goes away, unfortunately, with families who are adopted. But I think another huge thing is making sure that your child knows they don't have to explain themselves, and they have the right to correct people appropriately and respectfully when they're doing things that are wrong. So the next slide is having the talking about racism and racialized violence. I think this is a topic that for many people is this double-edged sword. I remember having a conversation years back in a previous role with this mother who was really contemplating how to talk to her. She's a white mom contemplating how to talk to her Black son about racialized violence. She was really concerned. They were growing up in a neighborhood where his friends were kind of consistently getting in trouble with law enforcement, and she had this fear and knowing that eventually he would also probably have an interaction or encounter with law enforcement. And she was having this kind of internal battle out loud with me, and she mentioned, she said, how do I have this conversation with my child, knowing that he's really innocent right now, and I will be the one that breaks his heart if I have this conversation. And so I challenged her. I said, what is the risk and the cost if you don't have this conversation? And so to talk about young people, first of all, to know that for young people, it can be extremely confusing. I have many family members who are police officers who are incredible men and women, and I have nothing but utmost respect for officers. But I also know that on the street, I am seen as a woman of color, that my brother is seen as a man of color. But when it comes down to it, there's still a lot of attitudes that are historically kept. And right now, we are in a very charged society. And so it's important to talk to your children about being safe, especially when it comes to driving, when it comes to going places, when it comes to interacting with the police officers, when it comes to where your hands are, making sure that we're being really cognizant and have both the intention of, we want you to come home. And I know when my parents and I had the conversation, it was always, we're having this conversation with you because we want to make sure that you come home to us. Kim, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to this slide.
Sorry, Mercedes, I was muted. Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest conversations to have. And I'll say for myself, the thing that was so painful to me was knowing that people who looked like me were the ones who could inflict harm on my children. It's making me tear up just thinking about it. And wondering, because I will never be able to truly know, as much as our kids are pretty open with us about all of this, the whole conglomeration around adoption and race and multiculturalism and all the rest of it, as open as they are, I'll never truly know what that is like. That confusion of that person who I love, who's parenting me and is supposed to keep me safe, looks just like some of the people who I might be most afraid of or most in danger from, or, have had negative impacts on me. But it's super important to have the conversation. And I would say for above all other reasons, so that your children can trust that you are aware, can trust that you're not afraid to go with them where you have to go. And I mean that physically and emotionally. Um, and that you are going to try to be as brave as they are in the face of all kinds of losses that they have had. I remember it finally sunk into one of our kids who did not believe that driving while black was a real thing until he got thrown in the back of a police cruiser for running a stop sign, and called us from the police station to come and get him out and said, okay, I finally believe you because now I've seen what it's like. Um, we just don't want our kids to have to see what it's like in order to be prepared. So, bite the bullet. It's in a lot of ways, I think it's a scarier conversation for us moms and dads than the birds and the bees one. But it's a lot more important in many, many ways.
So many of us, I'm sure, have grown up learning the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But I would challenge that we need to extend the golden rule and we all need to upgrade to the platinum rule, which is do unto others as they would like to have done unto themselves. So treating your child, there's certain aspects of, your child is living in your home, so you get to make most of the rules. You're the parent. But in regards to your child's racial identity, you can't force them to choose an identity. You can't force them to be at a certain place with their racial identity. Identity is this lifelong process. And for a transracial adoptee, I think the best thing a parent can do is listen and be open. And be open in regards to change. Be open in regards to being humbled. And understand that there are journeys that we may need to take to really find our connection, especially as an adults. And realizing that it's okay to change. It is okay to adopt new attitudes. It is okay to struggle with something. It is okay to take some time to struggle, but to always let your child know that you're working on it. You're working on evolving. You're working on being in step with them, and that you're supportive of what they need to do to find connection to their culture. I think I'm ready for the next one. Uh, so, as a parent of a person of color, it is so important to be informed about the issues facing their communities. And white parents have this incredible ability to use their privilege as a person who is white to advocate for issues affecting communities of color. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things I can say as a woman of color that are going to be received better from my mom, from my dad, from somebody who doesn't look like me, which is really sad that I have to have my issues relayed through somebody else. But and sometimes the issues that are affecting the greater community may not be affecting your child today, presently, but in the future, they likely will, especially as your child is gaining independence and is navigating the world for himself. And this quote by Jaron is probably one of my favorites. Jaron Kim is doing incredible work around transracial adoptees, and especially transracial adoptees into adulthood. And so you aren't an ally just because you love a member of the community. You're an ally because you actively fight against racial injustice. And so I really think it's important that love is not enough. You have to be actively fighting, because these issues are not just issues that face this greater community. These are issues that that your child will face at some point or another.
Great point to make. Thank you. So, some of the things that we can be doing just every day to make sure that our children know that we value them, we value the community that they come from, and that we are paying attention. Just to have the things in your home reflect your child's heritage: books, periodicals, toys, games, artwork, and people. Lots and lots of people who are connected to you that come from their community as well. Participate in cultural activities in your community. And I say this really as a normal way of being. Going to, a Caribbean festival once a year, or Cinco de Mayo, or celebrating Kwanzaa, that doesn't count. What counts is to be present, to be part of the culture, to be part of that community on a day-to-day basis. One of the easiest ways to do that is to join a faith community that reflects your child's cultural background, heritage. You'll be, if you're in a faith community, you're going to be getting together on a weekly basis, perhaps. Maybe not that often, but at least it's a community where people, just by nature of the fact that it's a faith-based piece, is going to be bringing people together, whether that is Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, whatever it is, there is a place where people are coming together. Be very clear with yourself and with your child as to their racial identity. There's a great video that's listed in our resources called Struggle for Identity, where there's a young woman in it playing piano. She is a young Asian woman playing piano. I believe she's Vietnamese. And she's talking about that she was playing piano next to her mom, who was of Northern European descent. And she said to her mom, look, my skin, my hand is so much different than yours. What am I? And the mother's response was, well, of course you're Swedish. We're all Swedish. And this little girl is looking at her hands thinking, not only do I not have an answer, but I've now been given a lie that makes no sense whatsoever. I just can't imagine that this young woman um, felt comfortable in her own skin or felt safe talking to her family about who she was and how she felt and where she fit in the world. I think it's super important for our kids to see that we're active in social change, and that we are completely intolerant of racism. And and that includes even things that are supposed to be jokes. If everyone's not laughing, it sure isn't a joke. I know for my kids, a couple of the things that changed for our family when they joined us. One was that I immediately quit my job, in search of a job where I could be the employee, answering to people who looked like my children. I knew that everywhere they looked, they were seeing white people in charge, and I really wanted them to be very much aware of the fact that I answered to someone who looked like them. They came to my work a lot. I worked in the inner city in Boston, and they even would comment on the way that I would drive through the streets. Um, the way that I would talk to people in stores. They were very, very attentive to how I responded to, interacted with, and talked to people who looked like them. And I think it was an important piece that I could offer to them, to model that sense of community, and embracing and being humble and learning. I think we also have to know that it's okay to ask for help. We need to ask people that can actually give us the right answers for that help and be open to learning all the time. As parents, this can be kind of tough, but we really need to embrace the fact that not everything that our kids do is going to include us. They need to have a chance to be in their community on their own and negotiate, sort of where their place is and how they fit in. At the same time, I don't think we can be shy about joining them when it's appropriate, when they want us to, and when it makes sense. I think we always need to know whose side we're on. It's interesting, some of the comments that we white parents hear from other people, um, who know that we have adopted. Things like, "Oh my goodness, you must be saints. Oh, I couldn't do that. That's such a great thing." My least favorite of all of them, I think, was, "Your children are so lucky to have you." And on so many levels, I just think that that's kind of a crazy statement. But in all of these cases, I'm on the side of my children. I'm on the side of understanding that in order for them to be in my family, they had to have lost a whole lot. And being in my family was not what was going to make them good or successful or wonderful. Those things were already in them. My family was just offering them a safe place to grow and become. Knowing how to choose your battles is super, super important. Um, it's not only that you can't do everything, which is part of it, but I think also we need to show our children enough respect to let them help us know when to help them and when not to. And one of the clear examples for me around this was when three of my children, my two adopted African American children and my, birth white child, all rode the bus together. And they would be called the Oreo cookie, and they would be called all these stupid racial, insulting names, and came home and told me about it. And I was like, well, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to get involved? Do you want to take care of this yourself? And they were all very clear that they understood that it was stupid comments and they could handle it on their own. They just wanted to know that they had my back, and I mean, that I had their back, excuse me. And they wanted to know that they had permission to respond to people that were treating them badly. And of course they did. However, as they got older and the bus rides um, one day became assaultive, then they came home and said, yeah, this time we want you to get involved. And so I did, of course, immediately and took action on their behalf. But it is certainly important to know that your kids are also in charge of those battles. Now, when your kids are not present and people are saying or doing things that are racist, whether it's an implicit bias or an explicit bias, you certainly do need to speak up. You need to make it very clear to people that you are intolerant of racism, you are intolerant of jokes or comments that belittle other people or show little respect for them, and that in fact you are a person who does believe that everybody matters. And then finally, really thinking about embracing and celebrating diversity across the board. It's certainly going to enrich your life, but also it even further will lessen any kind of a feeling or a modeling in your family of us and them. So, as a white family with African American children, or white parents with African American children, it wasn't just white people and African American people that we wanted to be around and those cultures that we wanted to celebrate, but really celebrate and welcome all different kinds of cultures and open up our kids to experiences, but also model that acceptance that they needed to see. Super important. I've had people ask me, okay, so I'm thinking that we might adopt a child who is Black or a child who is Latino. And I I've heard that I should have friends. And my response is always like, wow, so you didn't have friends and you didn't see value in being connected with people from other cultures before, but now you're asking me where can you go and find friends? I think that's kind of a tough one. I think it makes me sometimes wonder the motivation for adopting transracially. Um, our kids need to see that we value adults, not just children who look like them. We also need to remember that we're going to learn the most from our child, and also from other cultural guides. If we're listening to our children, if we're open to hearing them tell us whatever they need to tell us without feeling like they're being disloyal or they're hurting our feelings, we're going to learn a ton from them. But I know as well for myself, I had lots of cultural guides. I looked to them for guidance. I asked them questions. I wanted to understand as much as I could to support my children. Attending integrated schools is super important. Two of our kids, actually, we paid for them to go to a private school so that it would be integrated. They didn't have the opportunity in our public school at that point in time. Living in an integrated community can be really, really helpful. And I will say about that, though, so we were trying to move when our kids were in middle school. We wanted to move into the inner city. We wanted to have a more culturally diverse community to live in. Ours was okay, but not great. And Justice was my child who came to me and said, I've already spent a couple of years here trying to get people to understand me and to know who I am and what I'm all about. I don't want to have to do that all over again. And it really took me aback. I had thought that what we were trying to do was the right thing. But I share that story just to say that Justice and Tanya and Melvin's need for being in their community of origin was satisfied in so many different ways. That Justice was really clear, we don't need to move where our family lives. We're already being surrounded by the people that I need to be surrounded by. So again, wanting to listen to our kids and let them help guide the way. We very much sought out services from our child's cultural community. We had a Black pediatrician. We had therapists who were African American or Latino, we really worked hard to make sure that people that were working with our family and in our family and doing any kind of services for our family reflected our kids and reflected diversity. And in terms of learning how to take good care of my children's skin and hair and dietary preferences, I don't mean to be a wise guy, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I was great with skin and dietary preferences, and I can't even do my own hair, but I was very, very attentive to, again, finding friends who were able to help me and were able to provide my kids with exactly what they needed um, for a beautiful, shining crown of hair that reflected everything about them. Mercedes, I think we're off to you.
Um, so I think it's really important. As a transracial adoptee, Kim pointed out before that we have this level of exposure. We don't get to hide. Everybody knows that we're adopted. In my community, it was blatantly obvious. I was one of the first Black people in my community. So my parents, here are my two parents, both white with this little Black girl. People had so many questions. And so my parents got really used to answering their questions. But as we got older, I got really sick and tired of everybody knowing everything. And while my family's really obvious, uh, I was tired of kind of being defined by my adoption. And that's not to say that in any way, shape, or form I am embarrassed of my adoption, but I got really tired of being considered my parents' adopted child. I am my parents' child, and I don't consider my parents my adopted parents. I consider my parents to be my mom and dad. Uh, so I think it's so important for parents to understand that they can share their own story with adoption, but you have to allow your child to have a say if and when their story is shared. And then also uh, to be able to model how to respond to people who ask questions. For some reason, when it comes to adoption, people just feel like they have the right to know and by people I mean the outside world feels like they have the right to know all the details of your family's intimate life. And it can feel like people are asking like personal questions about you, like maybe what color undergarments are you wearing today? You would never ask somebody that question. But sometimes these questions that the outside world asks can feel that personal. And so to be able to model to your child how to rebuttal those things, like, well, understand your curiosity, but I don't feel the need to respond to that. I don't feel like I need to explain my family. I don't know you that well. That's a really intimate question. And I think for a lot of people, uh, to just have that like humbling experience, it helps them to be better educated on the question that's asking and whom they're asking. And then to also understand who it is that's safe to share your story to. If it's maybe a family or a friend, like what's the motivation of the person asking uh, about your family? If it is a friend, maybe it's truly, I want to know your family better so I can better support you and better understand you. But if it's the random woman at the grocery store, which 9 out of 10 times in my experience was, they don't necessarily have any right to my story.
I just want to add one of the responses that our family developed around those kind of crazy questions, Mercedes, was to
Yeah,
very quietly and directly, with your head sort of cocked to one side like a curious child would do, just look them right in the eye and say, huh, why ever would you ask that? And then go
I
silent and let them respond.
think that's such an important response, and for people to have that. I think one more thing with that is that you will notice if you have multiple children in your home. My little sister, when she's alone with my parents, my little sister is white. She has never asked any questions or not asked questions because she seemingly fits the world's idea of what it is that a family would look like, right? And so when my brother and I go out, people are trying to put the pieces together. And so to an extent, we both understand. My brother and I, we make a lot of jokes about it. My brother and my mom always say, we're the Farkle family showing up. Like, we really do look like this really unique, eclectic family, but that is our family. And we don't feel like it needs to be explained, nor do we want to be defined as adopted. Like, we just want to be defined as the dollars. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. Another huge thing, as I mentioned before, Jaron Kim is doing incredible work on transracial adoption experiences for adoptees past the age of 18. But as an adult and being a person of color and navigating the world, I really have strived to be immersed in different cultures and demographics that are different from the community that I grew up in. And I've had many existential crises of where do I fit in. I have turned to many great authors, professors, peers, but the people that I've needed most are my parents throughout this. And so for many transracial adoptees, this is a point in their life that's really pivotal to the relationships with their parents. They decide at this point whether or not the relationships with their parents can continue, because it's whether or not parents are open to admitting, you're not perfect. My parents aren't perfect. They definitely had their fair share of mistakes, but they did their best with what they had. And they're also open to doing better in the future. So having the support of my parents and the openness has been really important. And then also knowing that my parents have admitted that they aren't perfect and that they want to continue to learn. My parents are not old, but older, and they're proof that you can teach old dogs new tricks. And I think that it's huge. And I really like the picture at the top because it's really true to the silliness of the things that I call my mom with. And it will be really small things around racial crisis that I'm having. But even just knowing that she's willing to talk with me about something that I know she doesn't understand, but she's trying to. She asks really good questions and things like to help me try to come around to understand so that she can truly understand. And at all times, are her questions perfect? No, but her intention of wanting to learn more and be better is so there. So it strengthens our relationship so much. Kim?
Oh, I thought this one was you. Sorry about that. So really what we want to do is to assure for all of everybody on the line that we are going to be evolving. We're not going to be the same person as we grow and as we learn as we were. And all of us, but particularly our young people, have that right to grow up with no apologies. From an adoptee, Jennifer on openadoption.org writes, "For those of you looking to adopt, I applaud you. I also caution you that a child can love you and still feel as if something is missing. Don't ever feel less than a wonderful parent. Give them the understanding that they need to heal." And I can tell you for each of the children that my husband and I adopted, this is absolutely true. I would say that all of them know completely that we love them. They know completely that they are members of the family and they don't ever have to question that. And we've had some pretty major struggles up and down. But the one thing that we also have been really clear about is that neither my husband nor I could offer our three African American children what they needed to fill that piece of their lives and their understanding. And it certainly did change with them year by year, sometimes 15 minutes by 15 minutes. We needed to go on the journey with them. For us, that journey included even a time when one of my children decided that they needed to follow in their father's footsteps, that was sort of the legacy that they didn't have a choice about. And those footsteps brought this child to be part of a gang. running with a gang that was quite dangerous, quite lethal for several years, and completely separating from the family. But when that child wanted to come back again, and when that child wanted to rejoin the family, our obligation and our duty, and actually our joy, was to be able to say, in our hearts, you never left. In our hearts, you are always here. And of course, you are back with us now. And so you are, you were always in our heart as part of our family, but we're going to welcome you back into our family, even knowing that there's danger for all of us with you coming home. We were able to negotiate that, and actually, more than anything, it was our child that was able to negotiate that and figure out how to keep that um, that ex- pretty much an experiment with a family legacy, how to keep that in its place, how to use that to understand who they were as a whole person, but also how to keep us from being entangled in that gang life, in ways that could have been quite dangerous for the whole family. But that was our child's unconditional commitment to us as well. I think it was a two-way street. And I think all of us adoptive parents, as our children become adults, um, really more than anything can see the fruit of all of our efforts when our kids come back to us and bring their children back to call us grandmother and grandfather, or in our case, Mimi and Pops. Um, but it's a journey that we have to be unconditionally committed to taking with them. And at what point in time, knowing that they are going to lead that journey. And it's our obligation to follow where they lead. That's the commitment we made as parents. Um, this is our contact information. There were a couple of resources that I was thinking about as we were talking with folks. You also have a handout. If you'll look at your handouts, there's both the PowerPoint presentation, but also a number of different resources. And there were a couple that I was thinking about while we were talking that I don't know if you got, but we will make sure to send them out to all of the attendees. I do see that we have about 5 or 6 minutes if people have any questions, and I also want to give Mercedes a chance to bring us home.
Sure. So first, are there any questions, if we can take any questions?
I don't see any popping up, Mercedes.
Okay. Uh, well, I think in just closing, we appreciate you all joining us so much. For those of you that are foster and adoptive parents, kinship, family members, it's so important, and it shows so much that you're showing up and being willing to learn and hear at these times. For me, having parents who are willing to learn and grow with me was vital to our relationships, and was vital to us creating that connection that we're always striving for. And so thank you all for taking the time out of your evening to join us. And we look forward to more opportunities to connect with you in the future.
Thanks, everyone, and good night.